Well, greetings, my friends. I hope you're all doing well. My next guest is Lara van Zuydam. In addition to being a financial services lawyer and yoga teacher in London, she is a professional astrologer who has presented on astrology and on the tarot. Today, we discuss her recent book, Soul, a modern guide to evolving in a conscious universe. I admire this book because it examines and defines many foundational concepts that get glossed over far too often in other texts. I found the book and this conversation to be very worthwhile, and I am definitely excited to share it with all of you. And so, with no further ado, here is my interview with Lara van Zuydam on Soul, a modern guide to evolving in a conscious universe. Thank you, my friends, and I hope you're all doing well. I really personally loved the book, and I've already been recommending it all over the place.
That's really kind of you, and I appreciate that so much. Even if people just take away one useful thing, because often we, for example, go to a conference and we might think most of it doesn't resonate, but there might be one really significant thing that jumps out, then I think I've done my job.
Hmm. No,
Um,
yeah, I would be
yeah,
shocked if anybody could read your book and not come away with it. Especially what I love about it is it's good for people who have been doing it for a while, but also like somebody who's new to these things could open the book and come away with a much better foundation than you usually get when you're like reading through all these texts and people are just throwing out terms without taking any time to define them, you know?
well, that was my intention because I had found it so frustrating that no one had done it, to my mind, in a granular way when I
Hmm.
was kind of at the beginning of my sort of exploration of magic and spirituality and the like. And I just found it endlessly frustrated. Now, maybe that's because of the way my brain works, is I like a clear explanation of things, a structured explanation. Otherwise, we're all just working on assumptions and
Hmm.
speculation, which is always dangerous, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And can you I mean, we're basically just into it now anyway.
Let's go.
I usually draw like a line between the introductory chat and then, but we'll just flow right into this. So, yeah, your book is titled Soul,
Yeah.
but within that, soul is an umbrella for so much more than like it's the whole concept of how the human energetic system is constructed, but really how the entire planetary and universal energetic system is constructed. So could you talk a little bit about your motivation for why you did this and what your primary goal was with your book?
So I decided earlier on in my exploration of magic and spirituality that there just wasn't enough information at a granular level out there on the soul, the notion of soul, what it was all about, what the context was. And I found that writers tended to, in the main, make references to the concept of soul, as if was a given, which it is, but not taking into account that for some people it's helpful to understand the context and to understand what exactly we're talking about. And there tended to be a lot of overlap between, as we were chatting about earlier, concepts of spirit versus soul versus other things. And so I had hoped at that point to be able to make that distinction clearer, but also to write more or provide more granular information about the soul, what it's about, and the context. And at that time, I was experiencing recurring visions, partly by way of dreams, partly through my own conscious efforts to connect with my higher intelligence, my own soul. And those dreams and visions were effectively steering me in the direction of writing about the soul, I realized. And a few years before that, I had been put in touch with the 19th century mystic Alice Bailey.
Mhm.
And I had found that although her writing was quite complex and abstract in many respects, it had served to validate my own understanding of the soul, but to add a layer of detail that I'd not previously had access to. So that's kind of the background. But to your earlier point, in terms of the kind of multifaceted universe or multiverse, as I now refer to it, I think that's a very valid point, which is you can't really talk about the soul, write about the soul, without acknowledging to some extent that we are living or existing in what is effectively a multiverse, or at least a universe in which there are a variety of other beings and energies who all materially impact humanity in different ways. So we can't ignore them. And so when I set about writing about the soul, I realized that in order to do the book justice and the theme justice, I had to really get into the nitty gritty of those other beings and energies. And looking back now, I only touched the tip of the iceberg in that respect. And there's so much more to say on that
Mm.
topic.
Right. It might be a whole volume, a whole series of books that you end up writing.
Possibly me or others.
So I was going to ask about Alice Bailey. Immediately, I wrote down the name. I plan on looking up her works as when we're done talking. But could you tell people a little bit about who Alice Bailey was and what the core of her teaching was?
Yeah, she's an interesting one because she was a mystic who was alive in the 19th century. I understand that she was also a teacher and an astrologer. And she writes about esoteric philosophical topics, but also her work is heavily about astrology. And I think the reason why it is so focused on astrology is because what her works are essentially saying is that we live in a universe in which planetary energies and energies from the constellations are having a material impact on us. And those energies are informed by what I'll loosely describe as the divine will or divine intention. And when we talk about divinity, and the book goes into divinity to some extent, we're talking about something which is ineffable, something which doesn't have a personality or a personality agenda. It sits above the notions of good and evil. So if you're familiar with the Kabbalah, for example, it's Ein Sof. It sits above the tree, Kether and the tree of life.
Mhm.
And so what I'm getting at is if you start with the notion that divinity exists between good and evil there's a particular cosmic order in nature generally. That cosmic patterning will be part of the fabric of the constellations. Those energies will then filter through into the various solar systems, and indeed our solar system through our sun and the other planets, and those energies filter down to us. And so when Alice Bailey was talking about these kind of very esoteric, abstract, cosmic, concepts, it was unavoidable, it was inevitable that she would also be talking about astrology. And indeed, she does go into a lot more detail for those of us who are astrologers and esoteric astrology about how in practice one can leverage those, patterns and in order to analyze charts and so on. So I've kind of gone down a bit of a meandering path, but hopefully that gives you a sense of what she's about. But do feel free to ask any clarificatory questions.
Hmm. That didn't feel meandering to me. That felt very pointed and focused. So
Good.
yeah, so the in what you suggest in there, and this comes up in your book, it's something that I admire, just because it's my own conclusions. But in the book, you talk about how there is a definite hierarchy to the spiritual makeup of the universe, but also to human beings. And you're very like you're careful in there. You keep saying like people aren't going to like to hear this, or you say this a couple times because of the times that we live in. Now, I just accept that as the obvious fact of life, but I understand where you're coming from. Like the times that we live in, you have to be there are very sensitive people out there. But could you just expand on that a little bit on the hierarchical nature of human development and of these energetic bodies in the universe?
Yeah. So I'm cautious in the book, and I'm generally cautious about that because what I'm in effect acknowledging is not only, inevitably there will be people who are more sensitive than others in the world in which we live, but if we think about it, we're all on different paths and we all have different levels of understanding. And there might be some people who approach the book with one particular level of understanding in order to get some information, but then you might approach the book with a very different agenda and a different consciousness. So I try to kind of cater, and it's quite difficult to do that as a writer, to try to cater for everyone, and sometimes it's impossible. But
Mm.
equally, I'm all about truth. So I always try to make sure that I really have integrity in my writing and the way in which I communicate things. So yeah, it is tricky, but essentially when we're talking about a hierarchy, we're talking about different levels of consciousness. So if we think about our physical bodies, we're operating in 3D, but we do as human beings have the ability to access other planes of consciousness in the fourth dimension. and via the astral body and other, psychic faculties and those sorts of that sort of makeup. And so what we have is there is a level of greater refinement that exists in 5D, and so on and so on. So there are beings out there who have refined their consciousness to a point where they vibrate at a far, far higher level than human beings. And as they kind of reach that point of consciousness and the expression of that consciousness, no doubt through hard work in their own rights, they get to the point where they become more conscious of the need to focus on the collective rather than the individual. That's what humanity is working on, by the way, as a collective. It's more about group consciousness rather than I and me and my agenda. But these other beings will work to some extent in service, but on a higher level. And
Mm.
so there are higher beings out there. And I found I've encountered a particular group of these beings through my own magical work, through my own vision work, as I call it. And to my great surprise, I noticed that other magicians and mystics had also encountered these beings, and they described them in very similar terms to my own experiences. Of course, it doesn't make it's not it makes perfect sense, and it's not surprising. And yet, it was interesting. It was validating to kind of to find that out. And yeah, so those beings are helper beings and they operate at a very high level and they're in service to the divine and they are materially or instrumentally involved in humanity's evolution.
Hmm. And there are also, you make clear in the book that we're not the bottom rung of this hierarchical ladder, humanity as a whole. There are lower beings, which include the shadow people and these various other things. Could you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, I've set it out quite broadly, and I'm sure there's a lot more to articulate on that subject. But in essence, they have reached a point in their own consciousness where perhaps they're not so focused on the development of soul and they're more focused on expression of personality. And in the book, I talk about the kind of the journey that we human beings have had, where at one point in the development of our consciousness, we were very focused on expressing ourselves through the personality, which has a by its very nature a lower or less kind of elevated agenda than the soul. So the personality and the soul are, two opposite ends of the spectrum. They're different polarities, and they each have their place, but really they represent a continuum of growth, of spiritual growth. And so back in the proverbial day, and linear time is a whole other subject, but for ease I'm going to refer to time as we would ordinarily refer to it. If we look at that point in the development of our consciousness, it may have been helpful for us to work with some of those beings as we learned to express ourselves through the personality. Now, there are many people, obviously, still in existence in the world today who are not yet as conscious or awake. They're still expressing personality, but the point is, the overarching objective of humanity is to become awakened and aware of soul. So I guess where I'm going is there are beings out there who do not have the same consciousness as us, and they do therefore operate in a way or can operate in a way which is counter to where we're wanting to head now. And they actually have a more destructive agenda in some cases, unfortunately, because for reasons unknown to us, they're still able to access the current plane that we operate in, the particular point in proverbial time that we find ourselves in from a consciousness evolution point of view. And I guess that's part of the polarities that we need to transcend as humanity. We always have to deal with so-called good and evil. That's part of our growth, and that's just one aspect of it. But it helps to be mindful of these beings because some of us are certainly more sensitive to this dynamic than others, and you can see that in the natal chart. But equally, the more we work energetically, the more visible we become and more susceptible we become towards being influenced by them, particularly if their agenda is counter to our agenda, which is to awaken humanity, and their agenda is fundamentally to hold humanity back.
Hmm.
I hope that makes sense.
No, absolutely. And you, in your book, you right now we're talking about the higher and the lower beings. You made a really interesting point in your book when speaking about the higher beings, where you point out that people develop this relationship of like unending I don't know. I can't think of the word right now.
Unconditional.
Yeah, like unconditional service to these deities, hoping to get things in return. They're always offering things and giving things. And you talk about this kind of like imbalanced deities and how it's an imbalanced relationship. And it's
Yes.
interesting because even though they're elevated, you speak them, but they're still flawed. They're kind of like, that guy or that woman who is just great at everything, but there's something off about them, and they're kind of like maybe unbalanced, and they can kind of be a destructive force to the people around them.
Yeah.
I found that really interesting. I've never heard it said that way before. Because you're looking at these things, even though they're much more powerful than we are, they're still
Yeah.
flawed. And again, could you talk about that a little bit?
Sure. It's interesting, isn't it? I guess it's important to not lose sight of the fact that these beings are not necessarily more elevated from a spiritual growth perspective. They're still operating very much along the lines of what we would generally refer to as ego, for simplicity's sake. But essentially, they may have a far more selfish agenda, and they have been fed by the energy in the form of thought forms and so on. I mean, you do get separate thought forms which are fueled by kind of worshipping over ages by human beings, different perhaps from the original entities or deities. And there is some overlap, I think, between these deities and some of the lower beings that I also referred to. And it's not always easy to be able to draw the line, but the key thing is just to be able to identify when a being is not operating unconditionally in service to divinity or is not sort of tuned into that, but in fact has selfish agendas and wants to hold back human beings, essentially. Now, some of these beings operate on a particular level in terms of service to the cosmos and in terms of being part of the fabric of the universe or the cosmos. And that's slightly different. So in magical workings, you can leverage some of them, obviously, with a lot of discernment and care because they can be dangerous. Um, but it is quite a complex web. And some of them, might not have a destructive agenda, but they can be dangerous, as I say. And those are distinct from the beings who do have an agenda to hold humanity back.
Hmm.
And
So
they're beings on their own paths, but maybe they're not quite at the level of evolution that they should be, despite their apparent abilities, which is where we can fall into a trap because we hero worship them.
mhm.
Sorry to speak over you.
No,
Um,
no, please go ahead. Please go ahead. I'm just the
we
question guy. We're here to listen to you. Please go
no,
ahead.
not at all. I realize that essentially at in the moment, essentially we have a habit, humanity has a habit of kind of elevating any beings that, have these ostensible abilities where and not remembering that they are conditional beings that may not be operating according to this notion of love wisdom that I talk about in the book, which is exercising one's ability to attract things to oneself with intelligence. So it's an intelligent form of desire, not just getting anything in which serves the personality. These things are more, or beings are more attuned to the lower personality related objectives. Although they may not necessarily be out there to destroy us. And I think I know there are beings out there who have that agenda. But there are many different beings. And as I say, what I put in the book is only the tip of the iceberg.
Yeah, and that is something I was going to bring up later. Something I really like about the book is, this world of esoteric spirituality is full of people who have gone off the rails and have experimented with things and destroyed themselves and destroyed their lives. And I see a lot of people like on the scene now that are like, yeah, yeah, just go play with this, do like experiment with that. And I admire that in your book, you're very clear about the dangers and you're telling people there are some things you just don't want to mess with. Like it's just that simple. Like why play with fire? So could you just expand on that a little bit? And because it comes up in your book quite often, and something I appreciate.
It does. And I think part of my kind of inherent makeup, spiritual makeup, maybe, or what I'm partly in part here to do is to be really aware of the kind of polarities in the universe and within myself. But equally, when it comes to practicing magic or getting involved in any of these kind of occult practices, whatever it happens to be, and it goes back to what I describe in the book, what I mentioned a couple of minutes ago, which is essentially humanity, human beings, are at a point of the development of our consciousness collectively where we're no longer fixated on expressing ourselves through the personality. We've long transcended that. And we're more about expressing ourselves through the higher intelligence or the soul and tuning into that, which is, again, plugged into the divine or cosmic patterning. But if we are getting involved with form-based entities or material-based entities, the entities who were useful to us when we were expressing ourselves through personality, the lower beings, then we are potentially holding ourselves back. And, it's not helpful to us. In fact, it can be quite dangerous. An example of how some human beings are inevitably setting their evolution back is in the form of what I will loosely refer to as black magic. And that is where, they're ignoring the kind of calling of the higher self to plug into the divine wisdom, what their soul ought to be focused, or what they ought to be focused on by tuning into the soul. And ultimately with the aim of being of service and, contributing to our collective evolution, and instead begin to undertake practices involving the evocation of beings, to kind of, for selfish purposes, to bring about goals for themselves. Now, let me be clear, I don't think there's anything objectionable in principle in terms of using magic to help oneself. I think there is a place for that. And I also think, to some extent, and I'll explain what I mean in a moment, it is acceptable to deal with black magic and what I refer to, borrowing from something I heard, which was really interesting, from the astrologer Nina Griffin, dealing with that type of magic in a homeopathic way. The key question that we have to ask ourselves is this in line with what my soul wants me to do? Am I connecting to my higher intelligence? Am I receiving untainted information from divinity? Or am I receiving information which has been corrupted or distorted or skewed by other beings who don't have my best interests in mind, so to speak? And I'll qualify what I meant by the homeopathic use of black magic. And I say this advisedly. And I'm very cautious about how I deal with it in the book. And I say, be careful about it. But essentially, borrowing from my own experiences, just to make my point clearer, what I did when I first began to practice magic is I focused on magic generally. I'm all about information. I love learning. But I fixated also, as part of my development, on this whole notion of black magic. What's it about? And I know in my past lives, I was definitely heavily involved in black magic. I have no doubt. And I've learned from that. And maybe that's partly why I was so interested in it. But part of my interest was born in the fact that I knew that I had to fully understand it in this lifetime in order to know what I needed to be aware of so that I could make the right decisions, and also to protect myself in case I was ever on the unfortunate receiving end of such. And so I went about studying black magic as well as the other forms of theurgy, the higher magic. I studied them hand in hand because, again, I was all about polarities. And of course, proper learning is not just about the theory. I had to get practical as well. So I made it my business to actually carry out a few rituals. For example, by way of the invocation of certain demonic entities as an experiment. I thought, let's see what happens. I say I laugh now, but it's actually serious business, as I say in the
I
book.
understand.
It's dangerous. But what this did is it taught me, it made me far more aware. It was far more personal to me of the dangers, because you realize if you lose control, what you're exposed to, could really, really be a problem for you. People have burnt out, they've gone into a state of darkness, they've fallen apart through dealing with these entities. You have to be really careful. And let me tell you, these things work. I came up with a particular number, for example, how much money I wanted to get. And I said, right, I'm going to make this a little bit abstract. It's not going to be a round number. It's not going to be guessed. It's going to be very precise. And let me tell you, this thing worked. And I developed a very healthy respect early on But I just want to caveat what I've just said because I never engaged in any sort of black magic in a way that interfered with anyone else's free will. That was always hardwired into me, and I'm grateful for that. So I always knew that that would be utterly inappropriate on a number of levels. But I did engage in some of the um, evocatory rituals and as part of my learning. And I equipped myself with the ability to know if I ever encountered black magic or if I was ever on the receiving end. But as I say in the book, it's really important to cultivate the right kind of support network through acting in service because you're acting unconditionally and you are far more protected. You are helped with early warning signs and so on. And one always needs to have a healthy dose of kind of humility, of being open to learning, but also learning from mistakes that one makes, and not having a sense of hubris and thinking that you've ever got to the end of your learning because it's a continual learning process, as you'll no doubt know, Jeff.
Mhm. Yeah, and you also in the book you use a specific example. You don't name the person, but there was somebody who was famous for working with angels, and it ended up kind of going sideways. And I believe it was a she determined that like she had been misled, and she swore off the whole practice, all of this stuff. It's an interesting story, but it raises the other level of the need for discernment here because the point you're making is we can't it's not always obvious what we're actually dealing with, right? Like it's not always something could be manipulating us and basically tricking us. Could you talk a little bit about that phenomenon and about how to discern if you have methods for how to discern?
Being a Sun Aries, part of my learning process is by bashing my head against a brick wall every now and again when I rush impulsively into something. And that has certainly happened to me in terms of my spiritual experiences, my spiritual learning and development. I had to learn through hard experience to be able to discern when something may be essentially dressing itself up as something else, but also to be aware that just because you have a kind of generalized intention of connecting with beings doesn't mean you're going to get the beings that are good for you because you're opening the door and anything can walk in. So I had to learn to kind of hardwire the appropriate intention at the gateway so that only the things that I needed to come in would come in. And also to realize that kind of frivolously engaging with things like divinatory tools might result in connection with beings who may not be great. It might be neutral. You could have a little bit of a scare. You could get something harmful. And one example, a relatively kind of anodyne example of this is I read the tarot and I like to collect tarot decks. And I remember getting a particular deck of cards, which I still have, incidentally. And this deck of cards, it was very kind of keyed into what I have realized afterwards is essentially form based beings. And simply opening the deck and beginning to work with these cards, just looking at them and beginning to tune into them, I was immediately taken to a dimension in which these beings were communicating with me. And I could tell very quickly what kind of energy I was dealing with. And again, some of these energies may be neutral. They're part of the fabric, the construction of the universe. They each has their place. They might not be at the same level as humanity, but they have their own place. They may not be harmful. But again, there are ones that are more harmful that are likely to manipulate and distort. And then I think I describe in the book an experience where was staying at a university residence for a conference, and I was being communicated with by a being which I thought was essentially, a being that used to be human was no longer alive. Some colloquially refer to these things as ghosts, discarnate spirits, and so on. And without any sort of due diligence, without properly looking into what this being was and checking that it was what it purported to be, I thought, well, let me go in and, it seems to be asking for some help. And this was a little bit of overconfidence on my part at that point. And it turned out that this being definitely had a demonic or shadow aspect to itself, and it was harmful, and it did harm me. Fortunately, I managed to help myself through that process, but it definitely impacted me. There's no doubt, and I felt the physiological and energetic results of that destructive being.
Mm.
But luckily, I had the tools, as I say, to be able to kind of deal with it myself. And, I ended the whole thing off with, by going to an acupuncturist and telling the acupuncturist essentially that I needed the equivalent in acupuncture terms of an exorcism. He'd never done it before, but he had been taught this thing as part of his training. And he said, oh,
Oh,
he's
wow.
open to it. He'll do it. And it was a phenomenal experience. I could feel something lifting off me energetically.
Mm.
So, I digress, but my point is, I have had a couple of knocks along the way, and it's helpful perversely because it's taught me. So now, when I go to a new place and I stay anywhere, I'm immediately thinking about, well, what's the energy? I don't just blindly go in. So I think because I have my 2 feet in different worlds, one in the kind of logical left brain, you know, world where these things are all the stuff of fantasies, and then the other foot in the very much the Piscean world of spirituality, and I've got lots of planets in Pisces I'll share with you. Um, I think because of that, I used to have a tendency just to shut down one or the other, and now I've learned to try to integrate both. So I can't just go to a new place and think, well, I'm not in spirituality mode. I should be okay. Now I'm very tuned into the fact that this is a reality, and I have to live that reality, and I have to be responsible. So I guess in the book, what I'm trying to do is to share my experiences in a way that's maybe helpful to other people who may be in similar positions to me, so that they don't make some of the mistakes I made.
Mm. Yeah, and it's admirable, I believe, because you are, without going into detail, you are a successful person in a prominent career,
Thank
and
you.
you put this book out. And and when I say successful for the listeners out there, I mean like in the normie, or as you refer to it, the Muggle sense, the Muggle sense.
Yeah.
Um, and so the fact is, and you're obviously very intelligent, you're logically minded, and you're aware of how certain people will perceive these stories that you're telling in this part of your life that you're sharing. And you discuss why you decided to go ahead with this anyway. Could you expand on that a little bit about your service, the sense of service, and your role here in on Earth in this incarnation?
Yeah, happy to try to tackle that one, and I'm still figuring it out. Part of being what I loosely refer to as a mystic, because I don't want to create any sort of pretentious labels around myself, and I kind of hesitate. But at the same time, I it's helpful to have a name for what I think I'm about. Part of that role is to not necessarily know what you're here to do. It's just to say, here I am. I'm happy to be of service. Use me as an instrument for whatever needs to happen at a
Mm,
cosmic level. And it may involve being asked to be in a particular place at a particular time, engage in a particular ritual or a particular vision, and you may not always know what the end result of that is, but you trust that you've tuned into the right networks. And the more you tuned into those networks who are all kind of operating at a higher level and are tuned into divinity, you know that you won't be allowed to do things unless you are ready for them, unless and therefore you develop a kind of relationship of trust with them. And the more you work in service, the more you do that. And I suppose it's been an evolving process for
mm,
me, certainly in this lifetime, where it started off when I was a child, very sensitive to energies and beings and so on, and had lots of kind of dreams, psychic dreams, I'd loosely refer to them as. And I became gradually aware that I needed to do something useful in the world. And at first, I used to, and at the same time, and this is evident in my chart, I also was kind of very focused on my kind of mundane career as a lawyer. And so I had these two things. And so I just went ahead, with developing, doing the things I needed to do in my career. But at the same time, I was becoming increasingly aware of this idea that I needed to be of service. I just knew it. I just knew that, and not in an egotistical way. And I want to
mm,
make that very clear. This was never about my personality or wanting to get some sort of glory. It's the opposite of that. In fact, in many ways, it's been an obstacle for me,
Mm.
and it's made life more difficult for me. And I'm okay with that because I just know that this is what I'm meant to do. So I think it's about tuning into one's higher intelligence to know what one is here to do, um, but also to just follow the clues. Because lots of people, I mean, when I was much younger, I used to have the same issue. I used to think, well, what is my purpose? And the
Hmm.
purpose, and I think I'm certainly not the first one to say this, is to use the kind of Buddhist proverb as chopping wood and fetching water before enlightenment. So it's like doing the little things, following the clues, following what you feel you want to do, because that's your higher intelligence saying, well, this is your next step. And even though it may not make sense at the time, so for example, my legal career, and there were times where I thought, what on earth am I doing in this world? But actually that was part of being a spiritual person, was operating in both worlds. And who knows what I do in that world as well at a spiritual level, but also what I'm getting spiritually and what I'm learning. Certainly, I had many spiritual lessons through my more mundane work, and so it's been an evolving process. But looking back at it now, I can see that there was a logic in how I didn't always need to know the next step because it was part of the plan, providing that I was tuned into my higher self and I wasn't getting waylaid by what my personality thought it wanted. So if my personality had thought, well, if I didn't get this promotion, that's it, that could have set me back. Instead, I was open to the fact that things weren't always going to go the way I wanted, but that there was a divine plan in place and that as long as I was following the clues, I was going to be okay. And I had to surrender my personality agenda. I had to surrender to what I thought I was going to get in that world and just be open to the fact that my path is because this is what I need to do in this lifetime. And there are different branches of it that may not look like everyone else's path. I've meandered again a little bit, but I
No,
hope
no,
that begins to address the question, which I think is quite a complex one.
no, it absolutely did. I was just while you were talking, I was just thinking how liberating that is to be able to understand that you're never going to be able to see the whole road, and you kind of have to trust um, that you can see the next step, and you have to learn what's the right next step, but you're not going to see the whole road ahead.
Yes,
And, yeah, and that's to me that's very liberating because it's when you're somebody who really wants to understand your role here, it can be so easy to kind of regress because your ego wants to understand this and to move forward, be like, what do I need to do? And it's all in my hands. And it's a great reminder that's not all in your hands. This is like a partnership. This is a partnership with something bigger than us. And so that's just what I was thinking about as you were speaking. But something you say in the book that I found really interesting is you say that reincarnation does not always happen moving forward in linear time, because time, in a sense, is an illusion. It's how we experience this mass of events. Could you go into that a little bit? Because that is a really mind-bending idea.
it is, isn't it? And I've
Yeah.
become increasingly conscious of this partly through having these visions, for example, of states of being, which I don't necessarily remember happening in the way they're presented to me in vision, but I know have happened or could possibly happen, if that makes sense. So, just to start off with, I guess I should put out there the idea that time as we know it is an artifice. It's a construct being given to humanity specifically to give us meaning, in order to give us a logical beginning and end to things. Because if you think about it, if we never had a clear beginning or end to experiences in our lives, it would be pretty meaningless and it wouldn't afford us as many opportunities to be able to modulate strong emotions.
Hmm.
It would almost be too easy, I think, in some senses. But because we are dealing with endless cycles of birth and death and rebirth, it helps to kind of give us the friction that we need for growth. And I think quantum physics is or understanding of quantum physics is beginning to move in the direction of this deep, abstract, esoteric philosophy, which is that there are infinite versions of ourselves all existing at the same time. And we can effectively switch to different versions of this reality by exercising the appropriate intention.
Hmm.
And we will sometimes be able to recall existences in different states from what we kind of recall in our current linear time model. So, for example, yeah, the one I've given you a couple of minutes ago, which is you might remember things in a particular way, but your conscious brain knows that the way in which matters played out at the time it was very different from what you can see. So you can see another possibility. And you know that at some level, that's because there was another version of you, of your lifetime, which you could have accessed or could have happened or was happening at the same time. The other thing is, and I know that's mind bending, and it definitely calls for a lot more reflection. And I speak for myself, and it's something that fascinates me endlessly. But I've started having more and more of these insights myself, and I'm realizing that this is true. And we're uncomfortable with it because it's just so abstract for us, but we will become increasingly conscious of this, I think.
Hmm.
Um, and I've also had some insights into future realities, which really blew my mind. But
Wow.
again, we can both individually and collectively as humanity, we can change our experiences of things. So if we set the right intentions, we might still have an experience in the same world that we know is super difficult with all the conflict and things that happening that are not fair and not just and awful for many human beings. By expressing our own intentions and framing our kind of mindset appropriately, we can have an experience in which we are not necessarily impacted in a way that is counter to our own development.
Hmm.
Within, of course, the general paradigm in which we exist, we've come in to experience certain things. What I mean by that is that we're given a blueprint. Our soul knows that we've come into this incarnation to experience X, Y, Z things
Hmm.
because that's part of our learning and development. And we have scope to influence, our experiences within that paradigm. And we don't necessarily have to buy into all of the terrible things that are going on. They might affect us. That might be might be our path, but we do have control in many respects or many instances. And we can, so it's important for people, and it's quite understandable, who find what's going on in the world really depressing and politics really depressing, and these human beings are letting us down. Well, the first thing is we shouldn't be putting our lives in the hands of someone else. We should always be taking responsibility for our own well-being and never assuming that any other human being has all the answers.
Hmm.
But secondly, to just try, if it's of any comfort, to focus on our own soul path and not to fixate on other things that are going on that we actually can't control
Hmm.
in the world. And
Hmm.
kind of distinct where the emotions start becoming, there's a surfeit of emotion in some way. For example, grief. For me, it's animal cruelty. It just tears me apart. I have to consciously reset my whole frame of reference, my whole intentional outlook to make sure I'm not sucked in by that negative emotion, then it starts to hold me back.
Hmm. So you're talking about we're going through these lives, we're reincarnating, and you eventually reach this point where we realize that service is really our core, which is what I've arrived at as well. It's like when people ask, "Well, what do you think of my spiritual path?" I'm trying to get the damn log out of my eye, man. Like that's it. I'm trying to get this log out of my eye and be a good person. And it's very difficult. The deeper you go, the more shadows you find. But so
Absolutely.
yeah, and if the end is service, are you on the school of thought that we're completely dissolving our ego and just like melting into the divine, into the one? Or does our individual consciousness, our individual kind of personality, does it retain some form?
So, my view is when we talk about the retention of form, actually, we're talking about the soul. That is, the endless watcher, the part of us that never dies, that is always going to be part of the fabric of the cosmos, never dies. But that's by its very nature more refined substance than the personality. So ultimately, I think there will be a point where we do divest ourselves of personality. And I think this is untested for me. This is something I need to reflect on more myself. But if you want my own view, I believe at the point where we evolve beyond our current human form and we're reaching higher levels of kind of creative expression in the cosmos, we may not need a personality. But at the moment, given what we've been allocated to give us the friction that we need for experience, we need a personality, because the personality is always going to be at odds with the soul. That's going to be the friction that we need because we're expressing ourselves in human form. Whereas in a more refined substance, I suspect the personality goes away. We're
Hmm.
transcending it completely. At the moment, in human form, what we're doing is attaining mastery of over the personality. So the personality no longer runs the show, but it's still necessarily there because it has to be in order for us to function as human beings. We have to have some form of personality in our current incarnation.
Hmm. And so the soul, like if you were to have 100 souls in a room that have completely burned away personality, are they all exactly the same? Are they just empty vessels for the divine will, or do they each retain something of their own energy?
My own understanding is that each one of them is unique, even
Hmm.
that though that's difficult to comprehend given how many souls there would be, and not
Right.
just human souls. There will be souls at all levels of evolution, plant cells, Freudian slip, plant souls, animal souls, rock souls, anything with a consciousness, because rocks, for example, do have a form of consciousness, even if it's nothing like us. So I believe they would all be unique. So there is meaning in some way. Um, but I think part of the problem is that in our current state of evolution, it's difficult for us to comprehend the whole picture. In fact, we don't have access to all the information, and therefore there will always be a degree of uncertainty around what the whole point is of all of this. All we can do is focus on what we've been tasked with in this particular form of existence, this incarnation, these incarnations as human beings, and work on that. And then I guess when we reach the next dimension, we are given access to greater understanding, greater wisdom and it would make more sense to us at that point. So it frustratingly we have to deal with the fact that we have limited understanding and always will until we transcend humanity,
Hmm.
our human form, essentially.
Yeah, and it is definitely very frustrating. It's hard to like even once you see that, you're mature, you're older, and you can see that, there's still that impulse. It's like, no, if I read this one more book, if I read this one more book, I'm gonna understand, and I won't have to wonder anymore. So I do find it personally very frustrating, but I absolutely agree that you're right, even though I will no doubt relapse at some point in the future and think that if I read this certain book, I will have it all figured out. But
The other thing, just to make a comment on that, if I
yeah,
may,
yeah.
the other thing, when I feel that I want more answers and I'm not getting them from books and I haven't been organically experiencing them as a person, I will deliberately go into higher states of consciousness or try to access them, transcendental states, and actually make contact with higher beings who may be able to give the information. They'll only give us so much information as they think we should have, but that we can specifically set out in a form of trance through vision work to consult higher beings, and they may just give us some of the answers.
Hmm. Yeah, the incident that I referred to earlier overseas, it was definitely like a communication from something else. And that's why, I try to tell people, like my friends, my good friends, nobody else is interested in the kind of things that I'm interested in. If they knew the depth of my interest, they'd probably think I was ridiculous. But I try to tell them like I don't know what else to say except that once you experience something like that, you can't go back. There's no turning back. Like if you do, you're turning back on yourself. Like you're turning back on the most profound, beautiful thing you've ever experienced in your life. And that's not it. Like who wants to do that? That's like betraying. It's like betraying your own life, betraying your own existence. But anyway, so we're coming to the end of the hour. Are there what would you like to share with people about your book? Any other projects that you might have, and just any other messages you might want to give viewers?
Thank you. I think, as I said at the outset, what would give me a great deal of satisfaction is that, if there's one thing that someone can take away as useful in the book, then I'm happy. However, I acknowledge the fact that we're all different, and it may not be for some readers, and that's equally fine. So, I'm not kind of fixated on people having to find it useful, but it would be great if it does resonate with some people. And ultimately, it's to simplify the notion of soul and our position in the universe. And hopefully, I've tried to do that. I hope people get some benefit from it. In terms of future projects, I am working on something at the moment, but frustratingly, I can't say anything more about
Mm,
it, but there
okay.
is something in the works. So, stay tuned. Feel free to kind of get in touch if you want to find out more about that. But yeah, that's I'm speaking at the Astrological Association conference on the 1st of September, and
Mm,
I am going to be talking about esoteric astrology for anyone who's interested in that. And it's available online and also in person.
very cool. And going back to Alice Bailey, who you referred to a lot in your book, what would you think? What would you suggest is the best starting point to get into Alice Bailey's work?
Such a good question and so difficult. If it were me, but this is me, I would probably try to use divination to establish what's best for me because I don't think one size fits all.
Hmm.
So I'd probably have the selection of books in front of me in some way, even if it was an abstract way, and I would carry out some form of selection based on divination. But if that doesn't resonate with you, you could also you could have a look at the different spread of books, and then you could kind of tune into what you think is for you. At a more kind of mundane level, if I had to be pushed, I would say a treatise on cosmic fire is really a wonderful place, I think, to start with her works because it brings in lots of different disparate writings and gives the whole picture.
Hmm.
But you've got to kind of really stick with it, and try not and take from it what's useful, and not get too despondent if not everything resonates all at once, because you might find that in a year's time something makes more sense than it did the
Hmm.
previous year, and so on, and things come out when they need to and they make sense when they need to.
Hmm.
So very
That's-
convoluted answer to a simple question, but there you go.
No, I love it. I love it. Even the answer to that simple question is fascinating. Like go into divination. Like I love it. It's perfect. So thank you very much for your time, Laura, and I hope the book is wildly successful, and I will definitely be following your work, and hopefully we'll chat again
Thank you.
sometime.
That would be amazing. It's been absolutely wonderful speaking to you. Thanks for having me.
Fantastic. Thank you, Laura. Have a good one.
Thanks. You too.